The answer is plot. I decided on plot. The reason why is that it seems to be much more of a plot-driven story. Because, for example, if I first go and look for the characters, then the kind of characters that I arrive on, they will shape the plot, right? Depending on their characteristics and their motives and stuff like that. So that's why I first want to create the plot. And then when I have the plot, look for the kind of characters to whom that would happen or who fit specific parts of the story, which should work in theory because I want different characters for each chapter. So today's video on plot is from Shailin. Shailin has been around for a long time too, I think, 2013. She might even be one of the OGs of Authortube. And I know she does different kinds of stuff, but there's also a lot of writing advice videos. The one video that I want to look at today is 9 tips for satisfying plot. That's the closest thing I could find on something that has details on how to develop the plot and isn't just like an overarching method like the one that we did yesterday.
Hey everyone, it's Shaelin and I'm here today with another video.
I think I said her name wrong, sorry.
So in today's video I wanted to talk about plot. A few weeks ago, I don't remember exactly when, I got an ask on Tumblr asking how to write a satisfying plot. When I wrote out that ask, I was like, oh, this is really useful, important stuff, and so I thought I would share it in a video. So whoever asked the question, thank you. So 9 tips for you on how to write a satisfying plot. Number 1 is genre awareness. I think this is a very important thing in so many areas. Genre awareness is exactly what it sounds like. It's being aware of the conventions of your genre, not just conventions like common tropes or whatever, but kind of what makes your genre what it is. Keep in mind that genres exist for a reason, so that people can find books that they will find enjoyable to read. So for that reason, what is a satisfying plot to read for a fantasy reader in the fantasy genre is going to be different from a romance reader reading in the romance genre versus a thriller reader reading in the thriller genre. I really stumbled over that sentence a lot. Now, of course, there are lots of books that really play with genre, or twist genre, or transcend genre, or do funky things with genre. It's still important to have genre awareness if you're writing that type of book. If you are writing in kind of a classic genre, if you were writing a thriller, if you were writing a mystery, etc., it is very important to know your genre well, because to know your genre well and know what makes a satisfying plot in that genre. You know, so for example, if you're writing romance, what's satisfying in a romance novel is going to be the romantic tension throughout, legitimate forces keeping the characters apart throughout the entire story, good chemistry between the characters, and then generally in a romance, the story ends happily. That's kind of a convention of romance. And then it's going to be a satisfying conclusion when the characters finally overcome those obstacles and finally end up together because the reader's been rooting for them because of their great chemistry throughout. And it's especially satisfying because they've been kept apart the whole book. And a lot of those same principles, obstacles, character relationships, really exist in all genres, but they appear in different ways. So that's why it's really great to have genre awareness always, but I think it's especially necessary when talking about writing a satisfying plot.
Okay, so this one confuses me a lot because, first of all, I get that you have to be aware of your genre, and I think the point that she made about the romance thing kind of illustrated. So it's really about knowing what the reader is there for, what they want to see, and playing into that, right? Delivering on that. So if you have a romance story, maybe don't kill the characters all at the end, unless, then again, you could do that too, right? It's a tragic romance. So kind of, I've always really struggled with this whole approach of starting with the market thing, because for me, genre, like I said yesterday, for me, it's always kind of a marketing thing. It's knowing what a book is so that you can find the right audience for it and tell the audience what they can expect, so that by setting the right expectations, giving the book a better chance of finding the right audience who would like it, right? And obviously what she means here is probably reverse engineer that, right? So anticipate what the reader will like about your book, and depending on that determines the genre. Yeah, so what do I do here? So basically you have to be aware of constraints in the genre. So far, based on what I have from the other videos that we did, it's more of a sort of sci-fi story, although it could also be fantasy, because right now it's really just time travel. I don't know if it's because of magic or because of invention or whatever. So, but starting with the original inspiration of the story, then that would be sci-fi stories. So saying it's sci-fi, which also is a really broad thing to already kind of classify the story when you don't even know what the story is. So, but saying it is that, what are the constraints? I don't know. I don't know enough of sci-fi genre stuff to know what are the constraints. I mean, I can list some based on all the kinds of stories that I like. So sci-fi needs to have some sort of new idea in it, some sort of new technology, usually bigger ideas, some sort of futuristic outlook. It doesn't have to be set in the future, but it has to have that element of something that we don't yet know, that is like the next step of our invention capabilities and stuff. It's always asking the question of how could this technology or invention affect humans, our world, how could it end our species in the worst case, stuff like that, right? So it's always kind of like, what if we met aliens? How would that affect us? What if we found time travel and used it? How would that change the whole of human history? All those kind of big questions related to some sort of new invention, some sort of new technology. And then obviously there are so many subgenres. So if you go into a Black Mirror approach, you take the most pessimistic look at it, and then there are different constraints in that area than there would be in a more optimistic version. I feel like this isn't a plotting thing when it comes to actually writing the plot, you know, kind of making up the plot the first time, but rather a thing that you would use in more of an editing way. So it's, you have the plot, you have the story, and then you look at genre awareness, at constraints in that thing, and how does your first draft or whatever play into that? How does it subvert it, and what doesn't work because there is a sort of expectation based on genres. So I kind of feel that's more like an editing thing than it is necessarily a starting point, but that also ties into the same question that I had yesterday, right? If you are someone who does start with genre awareness and have a very clear idea of the kind of story you want to write, how do you utilize it? How do you go about it? Do you look at other stories that are the kind of stories that you also want to tell and base it on that? Or just is it like the broad strokes of, like I said, right now I sort of listed like the most common known sci-fi things that come to mind, just based on me being a reader and based on me being a viewer, and having, you know, watched some videos talking about sci-fi and stuff. So kind of like this very broad approach to knowing the genre without really having ever really deep dived into it and really looked at it. So is that the starting point? Okay, but let's take a more practical approach here. So originally I said it's a future wartime travel story. So there are three things that have to happen in this story. There has to be an element of the future, so it should be a different world than the present storyline. It doesn't really need to be that much more advanced, but it just needs to have a clear contrast. Otherwise, it seems very boring. That would be something that I would think. So kind of like when you're expecting a future war, you're expecting some sort of, you know, more technology, more things that you wouldn't see in our timeline, stuff like that. So some sort of advanced element in there. And then obviously the war part has to be very much featured. So you want to see it. You also want to be thrown right into the action. So very much this whole chaos kind of, and very illustrating how bad the future has gotten. So in comparison to the present, it's really clear what's at stake. And then the third thing is obviously the time travel. And the time travel is the thing that actually, okay, this one actually I can do when it comes to genre awareness. I like time travel stories a lot, and I've read, watched, consumed pretty much every story that has time travel in it that I've come across because I like it so much. And the thing that I absolutely would want to see in a time travel story is that there is a puzzle element in there. So there's like, you get different pieces and in the end it fits perfectly together. So very much, and that's a very high example, Dark, you know, where everything made sense in the end, and not kind of like this Tomorrow War approach where it's just like a plot gimmick that creates more plot holes than a satisfying plot. So yeah, that very much plays into here. So I don't know how to do it, but I know that I want the plot to be something that can be pieced together with the storyline. What do I do with this now? I don't really... Can I kind of like shape the existing thing that I have here? So constraint is... Let's write it down here. Those are the only two things that I can really think of right now. Maybe we can come back to this afterwards.
Stories are essentially made of change, you know. A novel is made up of a bunch of little changes that add up to create the primary change. It's really what a story is. A story is change. If there's no change, there is no story happening, there's no narrative, then it's just a situation. If you can find a moment in the plot where nothing is changing, that is not a relevant moment to be including, or the moment isn't pulling its weight within the plot. And these little changes in the plot should be causing changes within the character. If the character's emotional state and just state as a human or not.
That's something that we can come back to once we have the character and the actual plot details figured out, how the overall plot affects the characters and their own arcs. But let's finish, and I have an idea for this.
For a long period of time, then that's also not really relevant to the plot. You know, the story is a story because of the character. The character is who is making this a story. So if there's no change happening in the plot and it's not reflecting as change within the character, then you've created kind of a lull in your plot where nothing is essentially happening.
Change thing is very innate already in the method that we did yesterday. So every one of these points is supposed to reflect some sort of change. So in that way, we already have a method on how to do it from yesterday. Number 1 is basically they live in peace, and number 8 is they have to flee their own world. So that's what changes overall. Beginning is peaceful world, ending of the story is being thrown off their own planet, sort of having to escape it. And between each of these points, there also needs to be a change happening, right? The 2 points that I struggled with the most yesterday, looking back at it, is go and search, because I'm not really sure where's the difference between go and search here. So in go, it's basically they go into this other world to find information on their attackers. And in search, they are still looking for that information. So it's the go then only would be somehow we found the way into this other world and we managed to get into this world, and that's the cutting point, and then it goes over to search. And search is the entire thing of this other world is dangerous, blah blah blah, until they find something that gives them more information. So right now I have no idea what search is, but if I define it like this, then that's the change between those two things. One is achieving, getting into the other world, and the other thing would be finding something. The search phase is over. So then I could do that here. I could define very clear points on what changes between each of those points, right? So just to make it more obvious and to remember when something cuts and when the next thing starts. Okay, so this change method actually works really nicely, I think, if you combine it with an existing method like the plot embryo, right? Because what I did here is basically for each of these plot points, or what do you call them? For each of these changing points from the plot embryo, I basically defined when it ends. So like very strict, clear outcome, and then it moves on to the next point. Meaning in one where humans live peacefully and that part comes to an end once the first outbreak cases start. In need, it goes from first outbreak cases to realizing this is some sort of alien invasion, some sort of alien threat. Then go happens once they find this other, or rather in 2 they find out that it's an alien threat by finding out that there's some sort of portal or whatever. In 3 they make it into the other world. This method worked really well because I already had a structure to apply it to. So that's what I would very much recommend. If you already have some sort of outline for your plot, apply this kind of change thing where between one thing and the other something changes. Because it's a really good exercise to really think about why this plot point matters, or it was here.
Yeah, this is a term that is used a lot in screenwriting, but is very, I think, important for no matter what kind of story you're writing. Setup and payoff is actually quite simple as a concept. It essentially just means that what you introduce into the story pays off later on. It's like that idea of Chekhov's gun. If you have a gun lying on the table in the first act, that gun is going to be fired in the third act. Things you introduce in the beginning.
Yeah, so basically the whole concept of don't make promises you don't intend to keep. Again, this is something that I think is, a lot of that is an editing technique. It's basically, once you have figured out what the story is, did I make promises in the beginning that I'm not keeping? Or rather looking at the beginning of the story, what does this promise and do I keep that? So what do I promise here? Like I said before, it plays a bit into the whole genre awareness, or maybe I did it wrong, but I kind of did genre awareness like this, where it's basically time travel has to be a satisfying puzzle of sorts. It can't just be a gimmick. That's something that I feel a lot of sci-fi plots, when they have time travel, promise and then don't hold up. Just because we know so many great time travel stories that did it so well, so we have a bit of that expectation. Yeah, just simply put, obviously it's the time travel. If you find time travel, it would be really nice to actually use it. Actually, now that I think about that, there's a problem that I have in there that I have to figure out, which is the other civilization. Because if you introduce another civilization of sorts, you do have to give more. You should use it for more than just like one scene and then never think about it again, right? So this other civilization does need to play into the overall context of what is going on. Maybe just as a world building element, but kind of at least some explanation. I'm not really sure how to do this because I can't really build a plot point on it right now. The thing is that for this storyline, because it's the prequel to the actual story that I want to tell, it would be way too much exposition to dive into this civilization now, right? So that civilization could be part of the overall mystery that they have to solve in the present storyline. So leaving this very much as like an open question would be really cool, to really make it clear in the future storyline that this is a question that will become relevant again and not just something that got lost.
Unpredictability. This is probably one of the most obvious ones. We generally expect that a good story isn't going to be predictable and a boring story is going to be predictable. In some books, unpredictability comes from actually like a drastic plot.
This is something that I have a real problem still with, right? Because if you look at the thing that I have so far, it's very predictable, exactly as you've seen it probably 100,000 times before. So how do I make it not predictable?
Twist where everything is shaken up. But in a lot of books, you don't necessarily need a plot twist. You don't need a dramatic turn. But rather, it just means that the plot progresses in a way that could not be foreseen from the beginning, even if this doesn't happen in a kind of snap of a moment. I wish I could explain concrete ways to make your plot non-predictable. I honestly don't know how. Obviously, avoiding things like tropes and cliches make your plot non-predictable. I don't know what I'm saying. I want to be able to explain how to write an unpredictable plot, but I don't know how, so I'm going to tell you what to do, but not how to do it. I'm sorry.
Okay, at least she's honest, right? So how would I do it? I think one of the best ways to make something unpredictable is to not make it clear from the get-go what it is. So, for example, if you make it clear from the beginning that you're telling a zombie story, most likely the viewer, the reader has read a ton of zombie stories, knows, or even if they haven't by this point, they basically know the basics of how a zombie works. So that makes the story very predictable because they know exactly what the monster does, right? Whereas if you told the first zombie story ever, then it would be much more unpredictable because they don't know what it is, what it does, what it wants, blah, blah, blah. So it's kind of like probably a play on how much information the reader has, especially in combination with how much information the character has. So my intuitive thought about this is that the more the reader knows in comparison to the character on what the story is and how the story works, the more predictable the story is, and the opposite would also be true. But let's shelve this question for now, because she mentioned the thing with the plot twist, right? I do want to come back to the plot twist. I think it would be cool to look at plot twist in combination with what I've got so far and see if I can fit one in or two.
But 5 is causality. Causality, this is maybe one of the most important ones. It's honestly quite easy to thinly veil non-causally connected events as being causally connected. It's not that difficult. I've had it before in plots. I've seen it a lot of times where you have a bunch of events that are in the same book or same story. They happen to the same character and they take place in the same setting. And that, at the time, seems like it is enough to make them a story and make them causally connected, but it's not. Those are just a bunch of events that happen to the same character in the same place or in the same book. Causality essentially is a domino effect. You know, you have every scene is necessitated by the previous scene. In poetic scene.
Okay, so this is really applicable. And also another thing which I feel is already intuitive in the story circle thing that we did yesterday, which is really if you remember yesterday I talked about the Pixar formula and how they have like this structure where it's this happens because of that, that happens because of that. It's the same thing, right? It's here too. So it's basically what is the origin event and how does that affect the rest of the story, which is exactly why I wanted to start with plot, because I need to have that chain of events before I can figure out who the characters are, because if I start with the character, then the character is going to affect the chain and then it doesn't end how I need it to end. So that's just because I had such a that's not a word, such a constraint on this story and this plot and how it has to go. So yes, I feel like I already have this in here. And if you would want to apply it, my suggestion is basically exactly what I said. Try the Pixar method, right? Which is basically this happens because, and because of this happens, and so on. And just go on with because of this happens, and then because of that happens, and so on. And that should help get you somewhere. Good luck.
Ask yourself, if the previous scene wasn't there, could this scene still happen? And then ask yourself, does this cause the next scene? That way, instead of just having, scenes that are happening to the same character in the same place, because that's not really...
Again, now she's getting into more of an editing approach rather than the writing it for the first time approach, right? Which is basically you can use the same thing then later on once you have the plot to see if it makes sense that it's in there. So that's something that I would come back to, not necessarily in this series, because this series is all about getting to an outline. But then once I have an outline, it would be a good technique to test it on, right? And in terms of having like those detailed scenes and then cutting some of them out. What I don't really know is if I would first, have like detailed outline of the scenes that I want to write, or if I just use like the most broad outline that I have here and then start writing and then go from there. Again, not something I figured out yet.
Story, mystery, and revelation. You know, stories are made up of questions. A plotline or a premise in itself is kind of a question, and really it's just a bunch of little questions that make up the book, and a lot of them will need to be answered for clarity, but others need to be left on the table for suspense. We can see this most obviously in a genre like mystery, where we have a whodunit, you know, that's a very obvious question for the plotline and one that we want answered. But at the introduction of pretty much every novel, we have a ton of questions. Who is this person? What's going on? What's going to happen? And those questions will be more specific based on the actual plot. And then this pairs with revelation. Revelation is kind of the other part that goes along with mystery. Mystery sets up, revelation ties together, and those two together are what make a plot satisfying. And this needs to happen at the proper rate. If you don't answer any questions, your plot will be really confusing. There's going to be a lot of information you're going to need to set up at the beginning, and those are questions that are being answered. So essentially, you want to answer the questions that you need to answer for clarity, and then there are going to be some questions you want to leave open.
Okay, so how to set up the mystery and how to do the revelation. I think in this context, I would do it the same way that I did the change, which is get a better sense of what questions I ask in which part and when it gets answered. So what I mean, for example, is if we go from a reader's perspective and the first part, so number 1, you, is very much a question, where are we? Right, so it's kind of like the reader starts the book and is basically, okay, so where are we? What is going on? Why should I care? Kind of like, those are the questions, right? And then that gets answered probably right away in terms of giving some context of where we are and giving a sense that something mysterious is going on that tells them why they should care, right? So here the answer would be so this is very vague and obviously no plot detail yet because I don't have any, but kind of like the question would be, where are we? What is going on? Why should I care? And the answer here would be, okay, you're in some sort of human world. You see, I don't know, we're on a street and there is a pile of clothes lying around with no person around who they could belong to. And that's kind of like giving the reader an opening mystery of sorts of, okay, so you're in some sort of human world and for some reason there are clothes all the way to socks and underwear and everything lying around. So is there some naked person running around or what is going on? You know, kind of like just an interesting, intriguing scene that makes them ask some questions just to have them stick around enough. And then that's where they stick around enough and then you set up kind of like here. I would probably start with showing what the fruit flies are doing. So showing why this threat is dangerous. I kind of go back to what they would do in horror movies where it's basically, if you take It Follows, it starts with some woman running away from an unseen attacker or whatever, right? We don't really understand what is going on. Cuts and then we see her on a beach, basically killed, right? And there, I always feel that's a really good setup for a horror monster to kind of, we don't see what the monster is, we just see what it does. So that we already have a very strong sense of the kind of danger that the characters are in before we even meet the character. So it's a bit like that. It's an opening that would very much start to tell the reader why whatever is happening here is dangerous. And then probably you have to have overarching questions, right? So again, I am very much just drawing on stories that I know and how they would do that, right? So please, if you have better insight or on how you would do that, let me know in the comments. What I would do here when it comes to the questions is, in Attack on Titan, it basically opens with we're in a world, there's some sort of Titan threat that we don't really understand, that the characters don't really understand. And a lot of the story is about finding out what are the Titans, why do they do what they do. That kind of overarching question, right? To have something that the reader wants answered. In this story setting here, obviously I don't want to tell them what the threat is, or rather I do want the reader to have a sense at the end of the future storyline what the threat does, that it's organized and that this is a smart whatever enemy that has a plan. But we don't really know why it does what it does. We don't really understand it. We don't necessarily, I don't know if we can see it or not. Kind of a lot of those mystery aspects still need to be kept, because otherwise the present storyline would be so boring. So the overarching question that gets asked at what point? So at which point do we hear? At 2, they find out that they're being attacked by something, right? So what is it? What does it want? And this question doesn't get answered until at 5 we get like the first part of the answer, which is it is a living thing and it is organized. I think this is the main question for... It's definitely the main question for the first half of the storyline. And then the second, now that we know it's a living thing and it's attacking, the new question would be 2 new questions. The overall question is, what is it? What does it want? Right? The whole what does it want remains. And the whole what is it there has been a first answer given which asks a lot of more questions. So the new one is, what does it want? What is it going to do? And does this question get answered? Not completely. I think it makes sense here. You don't want to basically end the story here with telling the reader, hey, by the way, this is the motivation, or basically this is the plan of what the fruit flies are going to do, and now they just start the present storyline with, okay, we know what the enemy is going to do, here's the plan. Because then again, you have this situation where probably the reader knows more than the characters, and then you're kind of like boring the reader in the present storyline because they already have a plan for how they would deal with that thing, whereas the characters probably need some time to get there. So what is it going to do? But when does the subversion then happen? Does that happen at 8? That would make sense, right? That's kind of like the last critical moment where it's basically, oh, we have time travel now, we have a bit of time to figure out how to use it before we actually use it, come up with a plan. And then the threat does something that was unexpected, which subverts what they originally thought it was going to do, and they don't have any time anymore. They just have to wing it. That could be cool. So at 4, they kind of think, what is it going to do? And they think, okay, we know it's an organized thing. It's obviously going to try to take over the world and does what it has been doing so far, which is first it won the war against the humans, and now it's basically starting an attack or spreading out the attack, right? And they expect that it will follow this pattern and just continue. So they have some time, but they don't have time because it does something else. So I don't know what exactly it is, but I know what I should be doing. Great. I'm going to spare you the whole process of trying this for each of these points now. You get what I'm doing, right? You can try it for yourself on your own story. Tell me if it works for you. I'm trying it out much more in depth too, and then we can compare notes tomorrow.
Unrest and resolution. Continuing on my theme of saying a story is essentially this. A story is essentially unrest. You could kind of essentially think of most plot lines by this model. You have a character who has some sort of emotional or internal unrest, but they don't have a way of changing it. The inciting incident happens, which gives them an opportunity to change this unrest that they feel within their life, no matter what kind of form it takes. They have this opportunity to change. And then the resolution doesn't necessarily mean they've achieved what they wanted, but it means their opportunity, their time in which they could kind of change their life has kind of come to an end.
Okay, so full disclosure, I jumped 2 points. I jumped the whole suspense and the emotional balance thing. So maybe go back and watch that part yourself. The reason why I jumped it is because right now I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed with still having to fully flesh out the causality chain words, and the mystery part with the question that I'm now asking and the answers. So I'm focusing on those two things first, and just going with those two tips, because there are a lot of tips in here, right? So, and this video is already so long. So last thing here would be having some sort of resolution, right? So that's the thing, because this is meant as a sort of, I don't know how I'm going to tell this story in combination with the present storyline, but right now the way I'm doing it, and also with this series here, is very much just to figure out what the story would be if I told it as a standalone, and how does it end, right? It obviously it cuts off, kind of, it doesn't have an overall story conclusion, but it has this whole change that I said before, where it starts out with humans living peacefully in their world as the dominant species. Maybe we can illustrate this point a bit later on in the scenes to kind of put some theme into there, and then it ends when they are being basically kicked off their own planet, having to flee back into the past, and very much no longer the dominant species. So this change between living in a safe world and not being the dominant species anymore and having to find a way to survive in that kind of new setting, that is very much the overall change that happens. The resolution here that happens is that they have a final plan of using the time travel to prevent this from happening in the first place. So I'm happy with that for now, because I just really need to use the chain of causality more. I want to go more into detail. So here is what I'm going to do now. I'm going to take each starting situation and ask this whole because of that, and see if I can go more into detail, more than just those 8 points, and trying to figure out more of the questions. So what would I be interested in seeing as a reader? What questions would I ask at what point, and what could be like the most satisfying way of revealing that all this information in here? So when do I reveal that there's time travel? Do I need to set that up, or could this be just like this one scene moment where they find it? Those kind of questions I want to ask more in depth. Let's go to the comments and see what I missed. That's also a really cool idea for the unpredictability. See, I would have gone with how do you tell the story, but obviously you can also just throw in a person who is just so unpredictable and see what they're doing. Would be actually very interested in how do you write an unpredictable character, especially if you yourself aren't necessarily an unpredictable person. Again, a problem for a future time, but definitely something to look at some point. Yeah, exactly, the causality. I also feel if there's one tip in this whole list that is really useful, it's the causality thing, right? Just to get some structure and to really make it a plot and not just a series of events. So yeah, I don't have anything else to look at. I am very busy now with just those causality, mystery. I'm going to focus on those two things. Really like this video. The only note I would have when it comes to this video is that obviously she titled it 9 tips for a satisfying plot. So that could be for when you first develop the plot, or when you're already trying to check if your plot is good, right? And the tips that she has in here are a mix of both, I feel. So some of them you can use when you're first writing your plot, and others you need to have a sort of plot to test it against. I had this point that's still open, right, which is the chosen one. And what do I do with the chosen one? The only constraint that I really have from the present storyline is that there has to be a chosen one, and they have to figure out that this person is in some way chosen, so that they come back into the past, look for that person and train that person up into being a chosen one, because otherwise the whole sibling aspect of not being a chosen one and having a chosen one in the story doesn't work. So that's the only constraint. So that means I have to find a way to tell the part of the story where they find the chosen one and why this person matters. Which is why tomorrow I want to look at subplot and how to create the subplot. Yeah, video here. See you tomorrow. Where I can create the subplot for this chosen one character.